All right, this is the second in a two-part video series exploring the ideas in Rameau's Génération Harmonique. Just to review where we've gotten so far, we have deduced several laws of music from the vibrating body, the corps sonore, as Rameau calls it, and the fundamental tone that this vibration of any musical object generates. It generates a tone which contains within itself both the major triad as its upper resonance, the minor triad through the arithmetic series or its lower resonance. And from there, we began to explore the idea of succession of fundamental tones, namely from the principal sound to the dominant, which gave us the the diatonic tetrachord of the ancient Greeks. And then by adding the subdominant, which is the first fifth moving in the other direction, generated by the principal sound, we were able to extend the whole scale. We were able to extend the diatonic succession up to an entire octave. Here's the image of that. And you may recall that we ran into some trouble between scale degree 6, here, this E, and scale degree 7, because it would involve a succession in the fundamental tone moving by step from C to D. And the problem with that is that all kinds of tuning issues arise between the harmonic sounds of these. And Rameau is trying to show that, well, the fundamental bass really always should move by fifth. And that is kind of the generative thing. So you may well have been a little bit nonplussed and maybe unimpressed by this derivation of the major scale. But if you hang tight, Rameau offers a better explanation later, which relies on dissonance. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. First, I want to then recall that the discussion of the tuning issues gave rise to this whole part of the treatise about temperament, where Rameau adopts equal temperament because he believes that temperament is a fundamental part of the fundamental bass. It's something that our ears do naturally as a result of the way we hear music. And we spent some time with this example 8. And there's just one other thing I wanted to mention about this before we moved on. I think when I was doing it to make the point about the tuning, I was leaving out these little notes. And Rameau says something quite interesting about them. This chromatic semitone from C to C sharp, he says it's really difficult to sing because see, the fundamental bass is moving by third and not by fifth. And because of that, the voice is quite uncertain in how to tune that because the fundamental bass succession is not what we're expecting in the diatonic order. And as a result, we'll just naturally put this little appoggiatura or coulé on the note. So if you ever wanted to know where French Baroque ornamentation came from, for Rameau, like everything else, it comes from the fundamental bass. Okay, so we should look at this example here. This is quite interesting. It turns out that to establish a tonic, according to Rameau, you need both fundamental sounds. I mean, that is to say, you need the fundamental sound, but you also need both of the upper dominant or the dominant and the dominant below, the subdominant. You need the upper and lower fifths in order to establish a key. So if you take a look at this example, you'll see that the first several notes are all the same. Just take a look at the first 4 notes are the same. We've got a melody moving from F sharp by step up to B. And as Rameau points out, it's not, this is completely ambiguous in terms of key. It's not until you have added the third fundamental sound, which in the first example happens on the 5th note, because we've got a C in the melody, and that's accompanied by, of course, the C fundamental sound, or the subdominant. And without that, there's no way to know what key we're in, no way to establish the tonic. And of course, for Rameau, all music is tonal. So it turns out that you need both of those opposing poles in order to establish a tonic. So in the first example, we're going to eventually end on a principal sound of G, as he shows here. And that is only established by the presence of both the lower fifth on C, or which is again the number 1, and the upper fifth on D, which is the number 9. And it's that combined with the cadence that confirms the key. Fa, sol, la, si, do, si, la, sol. So it's that presence of the do, or the ut, that gives us the sense of being in the key of G. Here we're going to start the same way, but we're going to remain kind of ambiguous this time all the way until we get back down to the F sharp, and then we're going to go to E, which of course has a principal sound of A, and that's going to confirm, well, all along we've been in the key of D. Fa, sol, la, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re. And so it turns out that you kind of need both of these opposing poles in order to establish the key. Now, is there a shorter way? Yes. And that would be a harmonic progression where you introduce dissonance to establish the key more securely without involving the third fundamental sound. So here's an example of 2 types of cadences. These are the 2 cadences that Rameau describes, or 2 of the most important ones. We have the perfect cadence with a fundamental bass moving from D to G. And over top of that, if we add the 7th, which, remember where the 7th comes from, where this note C comes from, it normally would be generated by the only fundamental sound that's not shown in this progression. So we borrow the 7th from the subdominant, and that establishes the key more securely, because that dissonance of the 7th tells us for sure that that is a dominant tonique, or a dominant chord, moving to a tonic chord, rather than some other kind of chord that is ambiguous. So in other words, this could, because of the dissonance, this could not be tonic subdominant. Instead, it's clearly dominant tonic. And that's confirmed by the dissonance. Well, so is there a way that we could use the subdominant moving to the tonic and have a dissonant progression that also confirms the key without using the dominant sound? And it turns out that we can. And this is what's new in Génération Harmonique as opposed to the Traité de l'Harmonie. So now, if we have an imperfect cadence, what nowadays we would call a plagal cadence, so you have to kind of bear in mind Rameau's terminology is a little different from the way we talk about harmony now. An imperfect cadence for Rameau moves from the subdominant to the tonic. And if you add the major sixth above the subdominant, that also will confirm the key, because the major sixth, it's like a mirror of the dominant. So in the dominant harmony, we have a major triad, and then we added a minor third on top of that to get this dissonant 7th. And the same thing applies in the subdominant. We have a major triad, and then we're going to add a minor third below, because remember the subdominant is kind of generated downwards. And that's going to give us this chord with a major sixth and a perfect fifth. And that's going to move by that dissonant note, the major sixth, is going to move by step to the third of the tonic triad, just like the dissonant seventh moved by step to the third of the tonic triad in the perfect cadence. So in the imperfect cadence, we've got a 6/5 chord. So the salient motion here is this second on between the G and the A. And for Rameau, that is enough to establish that we're in the key of G major, approached by its subdominant chord with the dissonance. All right, so a couple little clarifications to make here. In the dominant seventh chord, the dissonant note is the seventh. The seventh has to resolve down by step. In the subdominant 6/5 chord for Rameau, the dissonant note is the major sixth, and it has to resolve up by step. And that happens because it's kind of this flip side or mirror of the dominant cadence or the perfect cadence. So there are these two different cadences, perfect and imperfect. Obviously, the terminology should clue you in that the perfect cadence is sort of preferable. It's kind of more cadential. But the imperfect cadence, or this kind of plagal motion, is also allowed. And in fact, this chord has that quality of subdominantness. So we've got a characteristic dominant chord, which is a seventh over scale degree 5, which then moves to the tonic. And we've got a characteristic subdominant chord, which is a 6/5 over scale degree 4, moving to tonic. Now, you may remember that in fundamental bass terms, you could stack the thirds up and find the root of the harmony, and that's usually the fundamental bass note. The exception to that is here. This chord has a fundamental of C, not A. So even though it contains C, E, G, and A, and we would think of it as a first inversion A minor seventh chord if we're being kind of modern about it, for Rameau, the fundamental bass of that chord is C when it's moving to the tonic. So that is this plagal motion. Not only is it allowed, it is compulsory when you have this chord moving to the tonic. It moves with this characteristic dissonance and resolving the dissonant major sixth up to the third of the tonic triad. So there's an exception in the fundamental bass where you would have a fundamental bass note that is not the root of the chord as we would now think of it. Okay, so we've got those two cadences, and either of them are sort of ideal at establishing the key. Now we can add minor dissonances to other harmonies as shown here. You've got a dissonant seventh, and it can move down by step over any of these progressions. So the fundamental bass can move a few different ways. This one, where the fundamental bass moves down by third, Rameau thinks of that as kind of an interrupted cadence. This one, where it moves down by fifth, is obviously either a perfect cadence, or in this case, we're, I guess, because we don't have a key signature, we're supposed to think that we're, well, it's a little unclear, but say this is a minor seventh chord moving to another dominant, because it seems to move as part of a succession of falling fifths, but that motion imitates the diatonic succession, right? Fundamental bass moving by fifth. Or you can have this, which is essentially like a deceptive cadence. So the fundamental bass can move down by seventh. This one is rare except as deceptive cadence. Okay, now, what about this subdominant chord when it moves not to the tonic but somewhere else. This is Rameau's famous idea of the double emploi, or the double employment of dissonance. And this is something, I think I mentioned it last time, that this is maybe the feature of Rameau's theory that my students are most skeptical of. But it goes something like this. If that 6/5 chord, remember it's got a fundamental of the subdominant, and it's got this added sixth above it. If it moves to the tonic like I just played, then it has a fundamental of C. That is, scale degree 4. But if it moves to the dominant, then its fundamental changes to A. Why? Well, if I think of the notes it has, C, E, G, and A, well, that is, as I just said, a minor 7th chord in inversion. And so if it's going to move to the dominant, D major, the G would become now the dissonant 7th, or the minor dissonance in Rameau's terminology, which would mean it would have to go down to D, or to F sharp rather, so descending by step, just like all dissonances have to resolve down by step. That's the old counterpoint rule, which is what Rameau is trying to explain with this previous example. The reason it does that is because of the fundamental bass succession, of course. That's his explanation for everything. So now, if I move from that subdominant 6/5 chord to the dominant, I reimagine the harmony as a 7th chord, which for Rameau is what he calls a simple dominant, but I'll just call it a 7th chord. And 7th chords tend to move in these successions of falling fifths, right? So by falling fifths until arriving back at the tonic, right? So that is the way 7th chords behave in jazz and in Rameau. And so he now can use this double employment. It's sort of like on the way in, we are expecting it to be a subdominant chord with its characteristic dissonance of the added sixth. And on the way out, if it goes from there to the dominant, well, then actually it started as a subdominant chord, but it ended up becoming a simple dominant as part of this falling fifth sequence. Well, that is now going to allow him to have a better explanation for the major scale. So here's the major scale. Remember again that the problem was on scale degree 6, the E, moving to scale degree 7, the F sharp. That's where the sort of hiccup was in the first explanation. So now we're going to go up from 1 to 5 the same way we did before. Sol, la, si, do, re. Now on the Mi, I'm going to play a 6/5 chord and that is going to have an apparent fundamental of C on the way in. So now we've got the fundamental bass moving by fifth. But then, because of where it continues to, I reinterpret it as having a fundamental bass of A as it's moving to D. So Rameau gets it both ways now. That chord, that dissonant chord that occurs there, has two possible fundamentals that we could perceive. So when we get to it, we can think of it as part of this succession by fifths where we have a fundamental of C. So just again to get up to scale degree 6. Sol, la, si, do, re, mi. And then I can imagine that if it stayed as a fundamental of C, well, I could go back down to G major. Mi, re, mi, re. And that would be well behaved. But instead, I'm going to continue up the scale. So I, in my mind, reinterpret it as now being an inversion of an A minor 7th chord, which of course moves very smoothly to D major for the dominant. Sol, la, si, do, re, mi, fa, sol. And now I've gotten all the way up the octave. And by that little sleight of hand, that double emploi, the double employment of the subdominant dissonance, I have managed to keep the fundamental bass moving by fourths and fifths, which is what we want, and arriving at the entire scale. So this, in other words, is natural. It's a natural consequence of all the preceding arguments. We could take a look at the descending major scale. Now we get a very plain fundamental bass moving by fourths and fifths. Notice that as we approach scale degree 5 in descent, we approach it from its dominant. Okay, so the beginning of the scale is in fact in the dominant key. And that's something that Rameau's theory shares with most other early 18th century approaches to scale harmonization. Like if you recall the rule of the octave that we've looked at elsewhere, that is indeed the case in the descending rule. So, and now on scale degree 4, we have a seventh, a dissonant 7th. So there we have our dominant 7th chord, and it works out nicely for this fundamental succession in descent. Sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, sol. And it's it works out very nicely for Rameau's theoretical ideas. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the minor mode, but Rameau derives it in much the same way as the major. Well, let's take stock again. We have now established our way through the diatonic succession. We've achieved the entire scale, and we've established the way that dissonance works, which is namely the 7th, in imitation of the characteristic dominant dissonance of the perfect cadence, is resolved down by step. So we've derived one of the kind of key fundamental rules of counterpoint from Rameau's fundamental bass. Now, the dominant 7th chord on 5, on scale degree 5, and the subdominant 6-5 chord on scale degree 4, they do not need preparation. And the reason for that is that in Rameau's thinking, they are fundamental sounds. They are natural consequences of the sounding body. They are generated by the process that we've been describing over the last video and a half. Now, the other dissonances do need to be prepared and resolved by step. Well, that creates a little bit of an issue for Rameau, who wants to unify everything that happens in music under his grand theory of the fundamental bass. So if you're familiar with French Baroque music, as you all are, you know that there is a pretty wide variety of dissonances. The dominant 7th is not the only dissonance that exists in French music. And the descending 5th sequence is not the only thing that happens on the surface of the music. There are all kinds of other harmonies. And Rameau, in the interest of getting his perfectly clear and reasoned view of music from his first principles, really takes special effort to show that all dissonances are 7ths. and that they all have to resolve by step, according to the traditional rules of counterpoint, because they are sevenths in the fundamental bass. Okay, what do I mean? Well, sometimes the fundamental bass note is not the one you'd expect. So again, this is meant to demolish the idea that the fundamental bass note is the root of the chord. It's not that. It's more about harmonic progression, and harmonic progression is driven by dissonance for Rameau. So let's take a look at these first three chords. This is a familiar enough succession of harmonies from opera, or recitative in particular, dating back at least 100 years before Rameau. So this chord in the middle is a dominant-ish chord over a pedal in the bass. So it's especially really striking if you've got a bowed bass instrument holding the bass line underneath that. It really creates a sense of tension, right? Something like that. And for Rameau, well, this has a dissonance in it, right? The sharp 7 stands for, a more full figuring would be 7-4-2, sharp 7-4-2. And that 4 is like the 7th of a dominant chord. And indeed, look, it resolves down by step like it should. This is C going to D. C going to B. And so, well, what's the fundamental bass of that chord? Well, it's D, because it's a D dominant 7th chord. Even though the basse continue, the continuo bass, is holding the G, the fundamental bass moves to the dominant and back in those three chords. This is called supposition. And that's a terminology that Rameau borrows from earlier continuo treatises in France. He uses it differently. And what's really weird and a little difficult is that he kind of changed his views of what supposition meant over the course of his career. But since we're looking at Génération Harmonique, just be aware that however he thought of it in 1737, it's probably different from the way he thought of it in 1722, and it's different from the way he thought of it in the 1750s, okay? So the bass note in the continuo, that is the G pedal point, is supposed under the fundamental bass, creating a harmony that is extends beyond the range of the octave, because it creates essentially an 11th chord, right? Because if you look at the notes up above, we've got the D and the F sharp, so that's the 7th, 5 and 7, and then we keep going up to 9 and 11. But we've already established very early on, and this was one of Rameau's kind of axiomatic principles, is that the octave is the limit, because beyond that, notes are just replicated. He takes octave equivalence very seriously, which means that the 11th chord extends beyond the possible range of harmonies. And as a result, it involves supposition. So the fundamental bass moves up to D, and we've got a full dominant 7th chord on D, and that's over the G in the bass. And that explains that really common harmony from recitative. Okay, so that's all well and good. This one usually people don't have much of a problem with. Now, we have our tonic, dominant, tonic, and now we're going to move to a 9/8 suspension over the note C. So, and of course, Rameau, includes also the B, because, he just loves dissonance, okay? So we're going to have all these notes sort of suspended over the C, and then resolve on the second beat to a 6/5 chord. Okay, well, let's think about the dissonant note there. The 9 over C is a D. And we know that's a dissonance, and it's a dissonance that extends beyond the range of the octave. So because it's a dissonance, it is a seventh. It's a seventh in a seventh chord, namely the seventh chord on E. So in this chord, which has a B and a D and an E and a G. I can't necessarily play them all on the lute. I'll do it that way. It's that suspension. The fundamental note of that for Rameau is E. So even though it's a C in the bass and it's a suspension that's going to resolve to a C harmony, for Rameau, the fundamental tone is E. So we've actually had the fundamental bass move down by third to E. So let me play the first 4 chords again. And in that last chord, the fundamental bass is E, and it's going to fall a fifth to A. So there's that subdominant dissonance. Why A and why not C? Because of where it's going. This is not even a double emploi, because there's no question that this is going to return to the tonic, right? This is happening as part of a falling fifth sequence. So we already are thinking of this as an inverted A minor 7th chord, and then it's going to move by descending fifths, A7 to D7, which is the dominant of the key, what Rameau calls the tonic dominant, and then by perfect cadence back to G. So the whole progression for Rameau has this underlying fundamental bass that is not what you would expect, right? These all look like vaguely root position chords, and you might want to analyze it with the fundamental bass that looks like this continuo bass, but no, for Rameau, there's a lot more going on. The fundamental bass, if I played that, there's this whole progression going on that is kind of underneath and generating the surface dissonances, which are not just 7th chords, but in fact, on the kind of below the surface in the fundamental bass, it's just a chain of 7th chords. Okay, and then we can move on to, here's a chord on A, and we're going to have a couple suspended notes, B and D. And again, the D, that top dissonance, the 4, is going to be the chord 7th. So we're going to assume a fundamental bass of E, even though it's a suspension on an A chord. So the fundamental bass always works to make the dissonance a 7th, because all dissonance has to be generated as the 7th of a fundamental sound in imitation of the perfect cadence. So this move to A, we're going to hear a fundamental of E, and then as it resolves to A, the fundamental is indeed going to move to A, where it already was in the continuo bass. And then we're going to move from there to the dominant 7th. Now take a look at this. This is just a simple cadence. Look at the top line. Dominant 7th. Tonic with an octave on top. This cannot be the cadence of the phrase because of the metric position. You have to cadence on a downbeat in Rameau's terms. So clearly we're going to go back to the dominant. Now take a look at this. The 4-3 suspension, just a very basic kind of feature of tonal music, the 4-3 suspension on the dominant chord. That 4, which is the tonic note, of G is going to be generated as the 7th of an A that is not there. So there's a chord, an A7 chord, and it's going to function by falling fifths, and that's going to give us this 4/3 cadence. And Rameau says underlying that is this progression, a falling fifths sequence. Okay, so let me play the whole phrase from the basse continue. And now let me play the basse fondamentale. I think you can see that they are related, right? They have a lot of the same surface notes, and the dissonant notes are all the same, because here they arise in all these various beautiful counterpoints that are typical of French Baroque music. And here, all the dissonances are explained as the sevenths of seventh chords. So that's Rameau's explanation for dissonance. It all has to be prepared and resolved in the usual way, but that happens kind of naturally by thinking of this kind of underlying harmonic succession based on sevenths. There's just one other thing I want to comment on, which is this move from G to A in the fundamental bass. You may ask, well, I thought we made a big deal of the fundamental bass moving by step when we were deriving the scale. And it is true that the fundamental bass cannot move by step from the scale degree 4 to scale degree 5. But for Rameau, in the fundamental bass, the tonic can go anywhere. So because G is the tonic, we're in the key of G, the next bass note can be anything, right? So the tonic, the piece starts with a tonic can go anywhere, and it's the other notes that are bound by these rules of moving either by fifths, falling fifths, or by falling fourths like the subdominant chord, which we don't even have an example of in this musical example. Now, one other thing to sort of clarify is, well, what if the bass moves not by fifth, but by third? I think I can find that example somewhere. Yes, here it is. So here's an example of the fundamental bass moving by third. So if we move from C to E, we get a major, C major to E major, and that's going to give us the chromatic semitone from G to G sharp. Sol, sol. And if we move by minor third, we're going to get the chromatic semitone going the other way. Mi, mi. If we move down by minor third, do, do. And if we move down by major third, mi, mi, we get the chromatic semitone again, descending. So the fundamental bass succession by thirds is principally the source of the chromatic genus. And you Greek theory scholars may be asking, well, what about the third genus, namely the enharmonic genus? And Rameau gets that also from succession by thirds. It's not shown here, but if you move by two major thirds in the same direction and skip the middle term, so like C to E to G sharp, well, that gives you your enharmonic reinterpretation, C over a C major chord, do becomes B sharp over a G sharp major chord. Do, si, And that enharmonic reinterpretation is what gives rise to the enharmonic genus. And Rameau uses those progressions a bit in some of his keyboard music and in a famous trio from the underworld scene in his first opera, Hippolyte et Aricie. Note that Hippolyte, 1733, is just 4 years before he wrote this book, Génération Harmonique. And you may know the story about the trio, that it was deemed unperformable, so it was not actually done at the premiere. And it uses this harmonic succession using the enharmonic genus, and it's quite possible that that played into why Rameau suggests the adoption of equal temperament in this treatise. Here are two other kinds of cadences for Rameau. Remember that the perfect cadence moves from dominant to tonic. The imperfect cadence moves from subdominant to tonic. We can have the cadence rompue, which for Rameau is the deceptive cadence. So we have a dominant seventh chord, and it's going to resolve not to G major like we expect. That's what this kind of cursor is showing, but to E with even possibly with a seventh, so the E can become a dominant of its own, or, and then presumably that would resolve in the usual way. Or another way you can kind of break the cadence, he calls this the interrupted cadence. The fundamental bass moves down by third, and in place of the G major chord, we get a B minor chord. So and often that might move to an inversion of the tonic chord. So those are the last two cadence types and very typical motions for Rameau. Okay, I'd like to conclude by just looking at some examples of Rameau's own fundamental bass analyses. You can see how they line up with our expectations. They are often quite surprising from our modern point of view. So here we have a very typical kind of lament bass descending tetrachord thing. Okay, so Rameau manages to interpret that whole thing as a descending fifth sequence. So the that simple chord where we added the sixth on top, we've got E minor, then the B moves to C, so we've got a six. Well, you'd think that's a first inversion C major chord, so the fundamental bass ought to be C. For Rameau, he's hearing it as a seventh on A. And the reason for that is because it sort of fits neatly into this succession. The C as a fundamental bass note is not going to want to move an augmented second to D. Whereas, this move of an augmented fourth within a falling fifth sequence is basically acceptable. So it's because of the context of where it's going. We have this dissonant seventh chord on D sharp, and that is indeed, he is going to take that as a fundamental of D sharp. Elsewhere in other treatises, he might well pick something else for that note. But then when we move from there to the D with a six, again, you might think this is B minor. It's a first inversion B minor triad. And for Rameau, it's a seventh chord on G. So he's much more likely to have these implied dissonances if they make his fundamental bass succession move the way he wants to, which is primarily by fourths and fifths. So he hears this as a fundamental of G, and then seventh on C sharp, this A minor triad, again, he's going to hear as a fundamental of F sharp as part of a falling fifth sequence going to the cadence. So let me play the simple version again with the basse continue. And here's Rameau's fundamental analysis. Sorry. Let me do that again. So, I mean, I think you can hear, if you play his fundamental chords, you can hear that a lot of the salient features are still there and kind of in this nifty harmonic progression. Now, the question is, would you play the dissonances required to produce this? That's a little ambiguous. Maybe not in this case, but even if you don't play them, they're kind of there, underlying it in this way that Rameau perceives. So it's almost like you have to imagine them in order to make sense of the music as it's presented to you. And so if you imagine these dissonances, you say, oh, well, this is just a nice little sequence that's down a fifth, up a fourth, down a fifth, up a fourth, and so forth, and then has a nice cadence at the end. And that can explain this bass line that otherwise looks like it's, might have different explanations. So again, the theory is meant to, it has some flexibility and it can be kind of surprising. Here's an important example. We'll just look at this first one, the dissonance. Here we have a kind of elaborated cadence moving from D to G. And in the course of it, we have these passing notes. The bass moves up to E, and then over top of it we have this G. So the kind of passing motion in tenths. Now so what would you think is the fundamental bass? Well, the fundamental bass note of the downbeat is obvious. It's a D dominant seventh chord, so we're gonna have a fundamental of D. Now, what about this chord on the second half note here? I see an E, I see a G, and a C. So you could think of a fundamental bass of C. Well, for Rameau, no. And the main reason is that we haven't resolved the dissonance. The dissonance has now become the root of a new chord. Remember, the note in here that's salient, that's dissonant, is the C. It's a minor dissonance, so it has to resolve down by step. But it hasn't gone anywhere yet. And since it hasn't gone anywhere yet, the fundamental bass hasn't changed. So these are just passing notes. These are what Rameau calls, notes of taste. So that not every kind of sonority on the surface of the music is going to have a fundamental bass note attached to it. Only the ones where the dissonances are behaving in the way that you'd expect. So these are just passing tones, and passing tones are not really dissonances in Rameau's sense. They're just notes of taste. They're things you might add to the surface. They don't affect the fundamental bass, so they're not really part of the harmonic progression, right? In fact, Rameau just views this whole measure as being a D dominant seventh chord moving to G. So the passing motion does not get reflected in the fundamental bass. Let's take a look at one more example. Here is a really typical Baroque progression. This is you might call this the Pachelbel bass, or lately people have been calling it the Romanesca. It's down a fourth, up a step, down a fourth, up a step. So the simple harmonies would be, G major, D major, E minor, B minor, C major, G major, and then, you could cadence, and then you've got Pachelbel's canon. You can also, and this is just a really typical Baroque pattern, alternate 4/3 suspensions on the ones you've leapt down to, and 9/8 suspensions on the ones you've gone up by step to. that's a progression that Rameau himself uses all the time. So famously in the Entrée de Polymnie, which of course, is from a couple decades after this Génération Harmonique, but also in some of his keyboard music. So in the big Allemande in A minor, I think it's the first piece in his book of new pieces for keyboard, he has this exact same sequence. So it's totally common in Rameau, and of course he knew what he was doing with it. But we have to figure out how to explain all the dissonances. Well, remember, any dissonance is a seventh, by definition, according to Rameau's theory. So the seventh above D is, the fourth above D is this G, and that's now dissonant. So we have to interpret that as a seventh of a seventh chord on A. And when it resolves down by step, so this is by supposition, right? Notice the fundamental bass goes up to A. The continuo bass is supposed, it's subposed, it's placed under or substitutes for the fundamental bass note. It's underneath it. And that's what gives rise to this seventh chord here. And when it resolves, well, the D is not a tonic. So even though there's no seventh here, because it's a dominant, you can assume a seventh. And then this next harmony, the 9 over the E, well, the suspension, the 9 over that chord is F sharp, shown here. And for Rameau, well, yeah, it's a seventh. So it's a seventh over G. And when it resolves down to E, we're going to hear the fundamental chord of E minor. But for Rameau, because we're in the middle of this chain of sevenths, well, yeah, it might look like an E minor chord, E, G, B, but those are all also part of a C7 chord. So we might as well just imagine a fundamental of C. And then, look, it's going to work out quite nicely. We've just turned this into a circle of fifths kind of progression. So the B, over the B, the dissonant note is now E, and that E is the seventh of a chord on F sharp. And so on and so forth. The pattern repeats itself. So listen to the basic Romanesca. Etc. And now listen to Rameau's interpretation of it in the fundamental bass. Isn't that cool? So there are, it's just been reinterpreted as, Autumn Leaves or, every Vivaldi Fortspinnung section ever. And so we've found this kind of pattern underlying this other progression that you might not have expected. So in the course of fundamental bass analysis, I guess the closing lesson for us, the analysis is not just determining the root of the chords. That's a complete misinterpretation of Rameau. It is finding the essence of the harmonic progression, kind of an underlying schema of harmonic progression that would make logical sense of the music as it's presented to us. So every dissonance is going to be interpreted as the seventh over some fundamental bass tone. Anytime you seem to have a bass moving by step, like even in a simple 1-4-5-1 kind of progression in modern terms, well, you'd think fundamental bass G, C, D, G, but that's not quite right, because there we've moved the fundamental bass by step. And so to avoid that, Rameau believes that we hear G, C, that's all good, but that when the C moves to D, we reinterpret that C as now being a seventh chord on A. G, C, A, D, G. So even if on the surface, the music seems to just move, the fundamental bass of that would be something like, there's this dissonant harmonic progression underneath it where the subdominant dissonance is reinterpreted mentally as a seventh chord on A, or a simple dominant moving to the dominant. So it's sort of, if you want to cast that in modern terms, it's subdominant on the way in, or plagal, and on the way out, it's predominant. It's moving to the dominant. And in the course of hearing that functionally, we imagine all these dissonances which make the progression fit with Rameau's theory. So everything, every harmonic progression possible, is generated in some way from this kind of these basic principles of the fundamental bass. And sometimes that will lead to surprising choices in the fundamental bass. It's not just isomorphic with finding the chord root or naming the Roman numerals. Those are later ideas. Those are things we've taken from Rameau and now take for granted in the way we talk about harmony. But for Rameau, there's this much kind of deeper connection to the need for the fundamental bass to move by the intervals suggested in its own kind of process of generation. All right, take care.